Okay, welcome back. It is early February 1870, and in this session, it's a soft goal, but we're going to try and look to wrap up the conflict with Austria. Now, anyone that, if you play grand strategy games, you know that this is fucking fatal. You should never set yourself a goal because you end up playing for sort of 12 hours or something, and I don't intend to do that, but we pretty much have achieved, for the most part, we want to achieve. The Austrian army is in no position to counter our moves now. We control the political heartland of the Austrian Empire. Once again, it's sort of familiar ground, but we want to try and secure, I think, two territories. Bucharest is non-negotiable. That is an absolute must. Bucharest, because of its good access to coal, which is going to be zero-sum, especially with mechanization of agriculture. It's going to drive up the demand for mechanical parts. That's going to drive up demand for steel. That's going to drive up demand for coal. Now, worst case scenario, we can import coal. We'll always import the raw material. We don't want to import the kind of middle, steel or mechanical parts. We don't want to import the kind of commodities because that's more expensive. That depresses our kind of turnover of liquidity in the economy. That slows our growth. So we want to try and maintain an economy of high growth, low inflation, with good access to liquidity. So we will import coal if we need to, but Drobeta and Bucharest, between them, this gives us access to 5 coal mining sites, and upgraded mechanized coal mining sites. That's a lot of coal. That would probably almost double our overall production of coal once these regions are exploited, upgraded, and given railroad access. It'll take a few years for that to happen, but it will be an important step for us. In terms of military operations, and we've secured most of these to the country now. We've got let's have a look. We've got the 6th Army under Ahmed Mukhtar going into Lemberg. He's being joined by the Imperial Guard Corps of that army under the command of Ahmed Esat. We've got Bezid's 4th Army going into Karpenvold. We've taken Krimnitz and Slovakia. I think we're going to... the idea was we're going to hold an anchoring position here for the time being, whilst the 7th Army drives up to take, I guess, Presburg or Bratislava, just north. That begins to secure the northern flank of Vienna, and will put us in a position increasingly to make a move against Prague. Prague is the next really, really big city. I mean, it's probably I guess, after Budapest. I suppose Budapest is going to be the second city, even though in this game it's kind of played almost as 2 cities. But it's the 3rd city of the Austrian Empire, really. I think that is the nail in the coffin, securing Prague. We're going to hold back in terms of providing any offers. We've only got 1 diplomat. Even with Abdulaziz, we have a very low diplomat income. It's just a feature of the Ottoman Empire during this period that it has limited clout on the international stage. That's realistic. I think even with a fairly resurgent Ottomans, that would have been the case. And we want those diplomats ideally for kind of domestic things like getting protectorate status colonies. We're moving Somalia over to protectorate status. That's going to take... we're 1 turn into 7 turns, so it's going to be 6 turns. I guess that's 12 weeks' time. Unless anything dramatic. What are they're playing colonial merchants. Yeah, I don't think anything Piedmont Sardinia can do now will stop that happening. And we'll keep an eye to see if they lay a kind of stake on Somalia. And the next candidate is going to be Somaliland. We do have the colonial penetration now necessary to move Somaliland into protectorate status. And that's a 2-tile colony. That's, it's not terribly resource rich. I mean, there's cotton. Cotton and wool are things that we do not have any kind of real shortage of in the Ottoman Empire. Even though probably the production of our guilds is still sufficient for the most part for domestic consumption, and that's with a really burgeoning textile industry, which we do have. We've begun the kind of process of mechanization of agriculture. It's the first step of mechanization, and the first thing is going to be a tobacco plantation just outside the capital. Now, we're going to keep an eye on that. It's steam tractors, so it's a very modest kind of mechanization. Steam tractors, in the UK, they're called traction engines. You still see them occasionally. They're not used anymore. They're obviously just kind of paraded out for nostalgic reasons. I actually know a guy. He's a history lecturer. He's a part of a group of people that maintain these and drive these around from time to time. I saw him once outside my window. I was woken up on a Sunday morning by the loud, because they have like iron wheels. I think, yeah, it's not even steel. They're like iron rim wheels. So when they're moving, you can hear them chundering along like a tank. And I woke up, looked out my window, and lo and behold, him and a bunch of guys were driving one of these things past. They're huge things. I suppose in terms of their application in the 19th century, it's just going to be moving, being able to move commodities, sort of en masse. It's I'd imagine even with large capitalist enterprises, the likes of which we have now scattered around the empire, I'd imagine probably it's still animals for the most part of pulling things, oxen or probably horses by now. Yeah, I mean, so these large, they are massive, they're huge things, these traction engines. I mean, they're bigger than modern tractors, probably a lot of that is just inefficiency in terms of sort of propulsion, but I mean, they're going to be able to pull huge trailers, many trailers of, I guess, tobacco or fertilizer or whatever is required, I don't know, to grow tobacco. So, that's going to be the first step. I think as I loaded this up, probably might be a feature of loading the game up, we've got an incorrect private capital reading. It might just be that when we pass turn, that kind of zeroes out and recalibrates itself. But as I recall, we had a very limited amount of private capital once we invested in tobacco. We haven't passed turn yet. We had about 800 private capital left. So my thinking is that is an incorrect reading. Let's have a look. Oh, no, it is a correct reading. It was actually if we invested in cereal farmers also. I wonder if we went for 2 tobacco plantations then. So that, yeah, so they don't all cost the same amount. Tobacco plantations are a little bit cheaper, I guess, because tobacco is sold at a higher price. It's a higher value, whereas cereals, you're doing this stuff on bulk, so it requires more traction engines. We're going to do one for the time being. We're going to do just the one, and it's going to be in just outside Constantinople, because we want to see how much it increases our demand. Our operational costs might increase the amount of capital slightly. I mean, it's going to, even if it still says 7 capital, it's still objectively going to increase the amount of capital going in to that RGO, because of course I think almost certainly require mechanical parts. These traction engines will require spare parts, and they require building, and they'll be built into mechanical parts. Mechanical parts factories in this game, they just represent machines, factories, or agricultural enterprises. So they'd have to be built. So that'll increase. There'll be a trickle of mechanical parts that'll have to go in. So that RGO plus, plus the steel for those mechanical parts. We'll keep an eye on that. We're going to do one. We're going to see that's a trial, and it'll give us an idea of what we can do. We'll also increase a cereals farm next. We are going to focus initially only on tobacco plantations, but I want to use the cereals farm again as an experiment. The cereals farm requires a lot more private capital to upgrade, so I guess there's a lot more traction engines going in, and yeah, we'll see, because before we kind of start spending out, going on a spending spree, upgrading over all of our agricultural enterprises. Bear in mind that agriculture, it's very cheap commodities. I mean, the last analysis, it wouldn't matter too much if we imported most of our cereals, and there's enough cereal production in the world now that we can do this almost probably to the end of the game without, any kind of prospect of famine, unless of course we're at war and blockaded. That would be different. But we want to do this and sort of to make sure that we're not going to end up with massive amounts flooding our kind of domestic market with cereals that we can never shift, that we're always going to struggle to export. And all we're really doing is making all of these cereal plantations completely unprofitable, because they're going to require a constant flow of mechanical parts, which is going to increase demand for steel domestically, which is going to then increase demand for coal. So we'll carefully, tentatively enter into the mechanization of agriculture. Our agriculture is mostly focused on the Balkan Peninsula. The Balkan Peninsula is the breadbasket of the Ottoman Empire. With a little bit of an exception, we expanded in the late 1850s agricultural production in the Middle East, mostly the Levant, but it's still, I think, I would say that 2/3 of our agricultural production is in the Balkan Peninsula. So this is going to be the area that we're going to be really mechanizing sort of agriculture. Our military moves, I think, are made. So the last thing is Abdi Pasha moving up to Pressburg. We're still pretty much holding a kind of defensive posture for the most part in the centre, although we have now released the second army. It's an 8-day march, which is very good. Hussein Avni is a fast mover, so even in quite difficult weather, he's able to cover quite a lot of ground, and it is still, for the most part, pretty difficult weather. Once he arrives in Fiume, he's then in sort of on the coast, and on the coast you have less snow. So he'd be there's more clement weather in Trieste, and we're in early Feb, so we can still expect another month, maybe even 6 weeks of bleak weather, and things will start to improve at the end of March. I think that's it. I think that's our military moves kind of pretty much already made. I can't remember whether at the end of the last video I had suggested that I might pass 10 and we'll pick up in late Feb, in which case I lied. We want to make the war shorter, really, because, with the change of the options, this will introduce much greater volatility in terms of sort of diplomatic affairs. I mean, our relations with France have sunk now to -1. They recovered slightly with Britain. They went up to 4. Now they're at 3. So the most sympathetic nations now see us in a very neutral way. France is starting to take a slightly sort of dim view of us. We're interested to see what's going to happen with France with regard to the Franco-Prussian War. I think the first catalyst is the Hohenzollern succession in Spain, although it might have been that then extended to Luxembourg. I can't recall the exact kind of sequence of events that unfolded, but Louis Napoleon III, faced with increasing domestic pressure, sees this as a bit of cheap kind of glory. It backfires spectacularly, sort of shades of Putin 2022. And yeah, the Prussians defeat France wholesale in that war, and this is hugely unexpected for the time. I mean, in the 1870s, France was still viewed as the principal land power on Earth. Despite the fact that it had been defeated in the Napoleonic Wars, it was a pretty touch-and-go war, and it was only defeated by a host of other nations. And I think I mentioned in earlier videos, it was so much of a blueprint for how to organize armies that even in the American Civil War, both the Confederacy and the Union had these sort of zouaves, these kind of strange, well, are really basically French colonial troops, but they had a slight specialization, which was light infantry, but they were copied wholesale, and not just by the Americans. Other powers had zouave colonial attachments, even though they didn't have colonies in North Africa. It's quite strange. Even the Ottomans, I think, developed zouave style units, which didn't really look like too much of a departure from their actual uniforms, but nevertheless they did it because of this kind of aping of French military traditions. The French defeat in the 1870s ends that. That has big political ramifications for the Ottomans, because the Ottomans had, they had tied their political system to the Bonapartist regime. The reformist period in the 1870s is kind of coming to an end, and not just in the Ottoman Empire, but it's the idea that you can have an absolutist monarch that is a reformist, that has a kind of window dressing of constitutionalism. The Franco-Prussian War reveals the Bonapartist regime as being very, very hollow, really. It's being all kind of hat and no trousers. And this has big political ramifications because for Abdelaziz, our current monarch, he sort of patronizes, if you like, a lot of kind of Bonapartist style officers in the army. Heavily influenced by France, they would have traveled to France and received some tutelage by the French High Command, and they also constitute Abdelaziz's political base, especially with regards to the navy. These people are undermined, they're politically undermined, and increasingly you have, of course, the new tradition that emerges is the Bismarckian tradition, the conservative tradition in Europe begins to emerge, and these are the officers that come to the forefront, and they take a pretty dim view of a lot of the kind of constitutionalism that Abdelaziz has embraced throughout his reign, and they're beginning to there's a clamouring for change. This is a general feature in the 1870s. In the 1870s, at the beginning of this game in 1850, we have Abdul Masih. He's the son, as is Abdelaziz, the son of Mahmud II. And this is the kind of tradition of the reforming sultans. They're carrying on the tradition that began really with the auspicious incident, the ending of the Janissaries, the bringing of the Ottoman Empire into the modern age. And a lot of that is really, really positive in terms of industrialization. We're far ahead of the industrialization game. To imagine that in real life, the Ottomans are beginning to lay railroads in the early 1870s. We have Sarajevo linked up to Baghdad, to the Levant, all the way down to Aden. So we're completely ahead of the game with regard to industrialization. We're probably more industrialized than the Ottoman Empire was ever industrialized in its existence, and it's only 1870. But the other things that these sultans were looking at is a kind of window dressing of constitutionalism, this kind of thing. It created a lot of instability, as I mentioned in a previous video, because they wanted to appoint prefects or governors to impose a kind of direct rule, which is the sort of thing modern states were doing. And the Ottoman Empire was just built on a patchwork of compromises and deals done with local brigands, and also their own early modern local governors, the beys, had become semi-autonomous. And this created a huge amount of instability. But it was important for the Ottomans that they had local governors that were appointed centrally, of course, because this created much less ambiguity with regard to the territory that was controlled by Constantinople. But it made the period inherently unstable, of course. By the 1870s, the men of the day are not Louis Napoleon III. We've moved further away from the revolutions of 48. In 1850, we're 2 years after a period of revolutions which shake the European regimes to their foundations, especially Austria. These are revolutions that are mostly liberal in character. They're looking at developing constitutionalism, and in the Austrian Empire, it develops an ethnic character as well, with Hungary essentially seceding from the Austrian Empire. And it's so volatile, it's so successful. The fledgling Hungarian state is so successful that the Austrians are not able to reimpose sort of central rule into Hungary, and actually it requires the intervention of Russia, a bulwark of conservatism, to reimpose the rule of Vienna in Hungary. So Russia is the least changed. However, in the 1860s, in the aftermath really of the Crimean War, even the Russians begin to concede that there have to be some kinds of changes, the end of serfdom and this kind of thing. You know, I mean, 1870 is now, 22 years away from the era of revolutions, the age of revolutions in 48. So what initially spooked, the upset of 48 that spooked a lot of these kind of absolutist monarchs in Berlin, Vienna, and in St. Petersburg, it's now 22 years ago, you know. I mean, I think that I'm a middle-aged person, so 22 years for me doesn't seem that long. It's like, the year 2000? But I mean, there's people that are driving on the roads that were born in the year 2000, you know. And if you were a young adult in your 20s, in 48, you're now going to be, in 1870, you're going to be in your 40s, you know. And you're going to, you could be an administrator, a bureaucrat, an advisor. And the men of the day are going to be Meiji in Japan, Bismarck. They're going to be conservative heroes. So we're entering now into a kind of era of conservative backlash, and that's not just expressed in the Ottoman Empire. You see this everywhere. This goes into the Belle Epoque, or the kind of period of the radical imperialism of the late 19th century, early 20th century. But that's going to really lay the foundations for the demise of Abdulaziz and the ascendancy ultimately of Abdul Hamid. And the consequences that has really for the Ottomans is Ottoman withdrawal. They're not, all of a sudden they don't like the idea of having kind of these really kind of heavy-duty deals with Paris and London. They begin to view these regimes with, real kind of, very, very suspicious of the idea of to what extent, I suppose, does dealings with London lead to the emergence of constitutionalism and instability in the Ottoman Empire. And Ottoman sultans did not like the idea of merely reigning as British monarchs did. They wanted to rule like the monarchs of Central and Eastern Europe. So they kind of politically align themselves with Vienna and Russia, but of course Vienna and Russia are ultimately their enemies. They are competitors, so it's a bit of a strategic error really. But anyway, tangential ramblings aside, I think we're going to pass turn. Everything has been set for the turn. I'm going to check exports. Exports appear to have been set. Lots of nice round figures. Assets balance sound enough. One thing that I did check, I don't know if we've had access to this before, but increased social protection. We can pass, in fact, we might as well do this because we have good access. Improve education system, we're always going to do that when we can. That's an annual thing. I'm not sure if we've had access to increased social protection before, although it's just gone under the radar. So it's on the basis of having access to 1,000 private capital, 200 state funds. That's pretty much the only soft power we have. Now, the other feature of this era is kind of in sharp contrast. The trending conservatism at the top is increased domestic pressures, and that's of course because of the Industrial Revolution. In the West we have a very nostalgic view of the Industrial Revolution, and understandably, but the Industrial Revolution, at the time it wasn't quite so hunky-dory if you were living through the period. I mean, the Industrial Revolution initially leads to a profound increase in poverty, a decline in life expectancy and this kind of thing, because urbanization happens with very little in the way of historical precedents. There had been large cities before, in antiquity, Rome, late antiquity, the Middle Ages, and then again in the early modern period, Constantinople, Beijing, but they were fairly rare. Large cities were not the norm, and these large cities of earlier epochs were pretty modestly sized when compared to industrial cities. What you're seeing now is that even in places like as small as Prussia, is cities the size of Rome cropping up everywhere. In France, in Britain, this is happening all over the place, and there's very little in the way of city planning. There's very little in the way of kind of measures taken to sort of offset the problems of urbanization. And one of the problems of urbanization is that you go, if you went into Rome, you're probably in the classical period, you're going there to die, sort of thing. I mean, there are a lot of benefits to being in a large city, but you're dependent then on food. I mean, in the case of Rome, sort of food welfare, really. Bread and circuses. But it's cities are not very sort of safe or healthy places to be. A really good concrete example is during the Crimean War. In the Crimean War, when the British were sort of recruiting to expand their army to send an expeditionary force This never happened before, but they started seeing men that were emaciated, that just didn't meet the physical requirements for army entry. And this was a widespread problem because men were coming from towns, industrial towns and cities. These men were riddled with parasites, worms and lice. They were just emaciated. In prior periods, where most men worked in agriculture, would have been fairly physically fit and healthy. And when people worked in agriculture in the Middle Ages and early modern period, they didn't work all year round. They didn't work around the clock like people do today. Today, people have to work 8 or in the Industrial Revolution, 12 hours a day, 6-7 days a week. They would kind of really work to the bone. In the Middle Ages and the early modern period, people would plant crops and then later in the year would harvest them, and then during off seasons they might trade some goods. They might go into towns and trade some goods. But people were typically fairly healthy, physically more fit in a relative way. Perhaps not compared to today. But they would have been more physically fit, and in any case, they would have certainly met the criteria for entry into the British Army, which was less the case in the 1850s. So it was noticed by the authorities, and the authorities did start taking some measures, really because they were looking to their own interests. And also there's the pressure from below, the development of trade unionism, radical politics, the beginning of the era of mass politics. These pressures are going to start building up inside the Ottoman Empire as well. And the Ottoman Empire doesn't have much in the way of... It's got a lot of stick, not so much carrot, but what we do have is, the one carrot we do have, as it turns out, is increased social protection. So we can pass reforms to alleviate some of the poverty at the base of society. That's interesting. It may be the case that option was available before, but for some reason it's escaped me. Or it may be that some reform has been passed, some technology that allows us to get access to it. We'll keep an eye on that, and that's something that we're going to start looking to pass as the situation, as internal pressure begins to build. It's early Feb, our military moves are made, economic administration has been set, exports have been set, assets balance looks perfectly sound, so I'm going to put you on pause, I'm going to pass turn, and we'll see you on the other side in late Feb. Okay, welcome back. It is late February, we've passed turn, and pretty good round. It's pretty predictable stuff militarily. For the first time, really, the engagements against the Austrians, they're not even really battles. They're just sort of brief contact followed by large Austrian surrenders. It's to be expected, but in sort of prior experiences, the Austrians still put up a bit of a fight. Their armies are just folding now. At Presburg, it's really just an assault against the town. That's fairly kind of small potatoes, really. It's at Prismil. I'm not sure how to pronounce this city. It's a large Austrian force, but it's not really. It's a one-round action, very brief stuff, and it's comfortably in the bag. And we take, again, less than 3,000 prisoners. And of the casualties we inflict, again, more than half of them are prisoners. But we destroy, wholesale, huge numbers of Austrian regiments are either just destroyed in action or they just surrender. At Prismel or Carpet von Lund, we actually take supply wagons. We're going to, before I forget, put those on rails, set to evade combat, and we're going to bring those back to the arsenal. I think we have railroad access to that city. We should do, or at least partial road access to supply wagons. There we go. 18 days. Yeah, okay, so we do, but it's routed through Bosnia as opposed to Transylvania. So yeah, pretty good action there. And there's a further engagement. This is an assault on a town. I don't think that's complete. I think it's is that incomplete? No, okay, we do take it. Okay, so the remainder, it's in the north. It's at Lemberg that we're actually besieging. So Ahmed Esat, who is now promotable, incidentally. The way you know that should be through a flickering icon here, which unless I'm sure I read a report that he was promotable. It might have been someone else, but you can generally see that. There we go. So Osman Nuri is promotable, and this kind of flickers to let you know. You don't have to promote them straight away. You don't receive any kind of penalties. For some time I was wondering whether you received a penalty for not promoting the general, but for the time being we'll keep him as a 2-star, but we will be looking to promote him because some 3-stars, I'd imagine, in the coming years are going to be pensioned off. Anyway, that's the action in the Austrian Empire. Now, in a strange way, more importantly, because this war is a done deal in more ways than one, and I'll let you know how the other ways that it's over reveal themselves in a moment. But let's look at the tobacco plantation is upgraded. So operational cost is still 7 capital, 1 coal. So I guess that's the coal to supply the traction engine and chemicals, fertilizers. Now that's interesting. We've just begun to ramp up our chemicals production in any case, and we have a number of chemical plantations or chemical labs, factories in construction. We have far more in construction than we actually have complete. We have one in Sofia, one in Salonika. We have, I think, one in Ankara. We also have one in, not Damascus. We have one in Baghdad also. So we've got sort of four chemical labs in construction. That's going to be fertilizer, I guess. Now, it may not be that every agricultural plantation, this is their operational cost. It might vary slightly because the upgrade cost varies. So we're also going to now upgrade the cereals farm, which we can do fairly comfortably. And we're going to now continue the upgrade of tobacco plantations. We know what the cost is. We know sort of what's required for that. That still leaves us with ample private capital. And yeah, we're going to continue that process. It's going to be the main focus for our sort of liquidity, the main demands on the sort of private capital stock that our ruling class has. Now, I started, before I kind of unpaused, I started then thinking about the kind of chain effect. So chemical labs require, so the production is both chemicals and dyes and 3 nitrates. So they take a lot of nitrates. We've only got 1 nitrate site, I think, and that's in Baghdad, I believe. And with so 1 pit with railroad access and upgrades, that's 13. That's quite a lot for 1 site, but we'll very, very quickly surpass what that single pit can provide us. There is the possibility to construct another pit in southwest Iraq. Now this is where it gets interesting. I was looking at other sites, one of which is in Athens. Okay, yeah. And of course the rules have changed. We changed the rules to give us claims. Now this might be a little bit tricky because Athens, Attica, I mean, it's the capital city, so I don't know whether we can take that or whether their capital then just moves to Patras or what the deal is there. We can certainly have a look though and sort of see whether or not we can get them to cede Athens. The other is the Qatar Depression, and again we don't have a claim on the Qatar Depression. We do on Gazala and on Siwa. Yeah, I'm thinking about I mean, this war is now over with Austria, and I said in more ways than one, so let's reveal the other way that it's over. The Austrians offer us a peace deal, and it is absolutely one that we're prepared to accept. So the peace deal, they are offering to cede West Croatia and Wallachia. West Croatia is basically Fiume. So if we look at the areas that we already control, it's basically Sarajevo, Bihać, Sava. So it would create a sort of a land corridor to the Adriatic. The Austrians would still keep Cattaro and Spalato. I suppose these are like the old Venetian territories. They control Venice. So they would control this as kind of an exclave, and they would, also only perhaps control it temporarily. We could look to kind of develop our position on the Dalmatian coastline. West Croatia is okay. I mean, the Dalmatian coastline is very agricultural, and it's quite flat land, I think, for the most part. It's quite arable, but this is quite good. It's two possible sites for cattle. What would they be called? Cattle. I'm trying to think of the word now. Okay, cattle farm. I was thinking of something else, I guess. Ranch. And 2 fishing ports. That's quite good. I mean, as agricultural land goes, yeah, we'll take it. And that's going to be a similar case in Spalato. Cato a little bit different. There's access to minerals there. We're going to take that peace deal. In fact, let's do it now. The main thing is Wallachia, to tell you the truth. This is really, really... I mean, like, when I look at this site, in more ways than one, okay, oil, we've got good access to oil, petroleum, and petroleum is not an important commodity just yet, and it won't be for many decades. But it's also the kind of, the outlet, really, of the kind of the Danube. The Danube here is going to be very silty. All the silt is going to be collected. It's really, really good arable land. You get access to 3 cereal sites here, plus 2 coal sites. This is and it's a pretty decent sized city. It's already fortified. It already has a large depot, so this is a staging ground for further operations against the Austrians in the future in the Carpathians, and that will connect up with Drobeta. We're going to maintain a military occupation of Romania for the duration until we're in a position where they basically offer us Drobeta, we claim it. So it's going to be a long-term occupation. Drobeta is going to be really, really important. Again, for its sort of access to coal. So that's it. That's going to be the end of the Austrian War. Let's go for it and accept that. Done deal. And if we just zoom out slightly, a little bit of Ottoman Empire map porn. Look at that. Shades of the 17th century. Lovely stuff. And I suppose the only blotch is going to be Greece and Egypt when we look at the map, you know, on the sort of surface of things. Although I think in the 18th century, the Venetians, they took control of the Peloponnese. It was Morosini. It was a pretty far out campaign because the Venetians were well into their period of decline. Their star had sort of sunk, but they managed to pull off an intervention against the Ottomans, I think, while they were tied up to the north, and took the Peloponnese for a period of time, which was retaken, of course. So, this summer, we're going to launch 2 military operations against minor powers. We're going to begin this decade asserting ourselves. This is the end of the first offensive war against a major power, albeit a major power significantly hobbled and weakened. You know, had we have not destroyed much of the large industrial plant of the Austrian Empire, this war might have been much more touch and go, frankly. And we should keep that in mind. We need to keep a sense of, it is a game that is, as I mentioned before, it's completely merciless when it goes against you. You know, it is, there's nothing you can do about it. There's no kind of like, there's no way you can game the system or anything like that. It's when it goes against you, it goes against you sort of thing. But we are going to try and begin to assert ourselves a little bit more. The options allow us to do that. And it could be a closing window with, you know, with an isolationist monarch. Okay, that's cheating a bit because we know the history, but that's fine. I mean, like, it's sort of, I think it's in keeping a little bit of Abdelaziz. He's asserting himself. He's visiting the European capitals. The Ottoman Empire is in a position now to kind of deal with things like the Greek question. Greece, the kind of sweetheart deal that Greece had from Europe, those days are gone. It's not the 1830s anymore. And I think a lot of Western intervention against the Ottomans was a function of the Ottomans' weakness. You know, it wasn't the case that in the 18th century or the 17th century you had Britain and France acting as arbiters and sort of deciding what territory went to who. You know, if the Ottoman Empire was a great power, the stakes are much higher. So for Britain to intervene, they have to really countenance a serious war against the more powerful countries. So it's less likely now that the Britain's going to support Greece because of, you know, the consequences of what they might have. Anyway, Greece does not have any kind of deals with Britain or France. It has quite poor relations with the great powers. It probably started off with a fairly advantageous position with Britain. That's no longer the case, so we're not going to hurt too much on the diplomatic front from an intervention against Greece. In terms of Egypt, we'll look at the relations of the great powers. Of all the powers, probably, I mean, Japan, I get whether Japan's a non-entity for us, really. I guess Italy, its position is slightly better, but Italy and Britain, you know, but there's still basically poor relations. So I think we can make a move here simultaneously, 2 operations. The first operation will call for 1 army corps to be deployed in Thessaly, I think. It's closest then to the kind of depot in Salonika. And it'll be 1 army corps will conduct a fairly, let's call it Operation Ajax. It'll call for a single move and an assault on the fortress at Athens. We'll then detach 1 army corps into Patras of the Peloponnese and control the Peloponnese. And then hold tight, hold our position. We might even actually move the entire army in assault because they have a fortified position there also. It's going to be a fairly simple kind of occupation, I think. Famous last words, you know. Again, Putin 2022, trips over shoelaces, falls into bowl of soup, sort of thing. The other will call for 1 army corps to be deployed via rail to Judea. We're going to break that army up into sections, I guess. We'll probably move an army corps at a time, probably within 6 to 8 weeks. So we can have this positioned easily, I think, for July. That army corps will then move as one into the Sinai. This might take a bit of time. The Sinai is undeveloped area. We have built roads into the Sinai, so it's not as bad as it once was. And position us for a move into Suez. The other will call for an ad hoc formation, and this is where things get slippery, because our depot in Benghazi, it's not bad, it's fairly well stocked, but it's going to struggle to push supplies. And there are roads along the northern coast, but I mean, historically, as was the case in the Second World War, it's tricky to get supplies much further east than Salum. We might actually just push a force out to Salum as a defensive screen, and land an army corps in Ajax. Now this is going to be the real prize for Egypt. It's not actually Cairo or sort of dissolving the Egyptian state. We don't really care too much about the independent kind of Beylik or sort of Beylik, really, is it? It's something else. But it's we're not too fussed about occupying Cairo. I mean, Cairo is a big city. It's definitely a really rich area, as you can imagine, for agriculture. But Ajax is going to be the main goal. We're not going to take that in the first conflict. We have claims in Gazala. That gives us a neighbouring position for Qatar and Ajax. So after the war, we would then have a claim on Qatar and Ajax. We are going to seize Suez. So the idea is going to be to seize Gazala and Suez in the first war. We do that by holding a screen in Gazala, basically screening our possessions in Cyrenaica, landing an army corps, and an amphibious landing at Alexandria. It's going to have to be a force. We'll have to land in force. We're going to be looking at landing 70,000 men. We still have that big transport fleet, that sort of inheritance from an earlier plan, which never really came off. So we've got a lot. We can project a lot of strength, a lot of force, and we're going to combine that landing with a move into Suez, and then ultimately, I guess, we'll push on and occupy Cairo. And we're going to see if we can get them to cede Gazala and Suez. It might take a bit of time. We might have to occupy these regions for a year or so, and it's a little bit risky, this, but we are going to start this decade by asserting ourselves. We're entering the decade with a new kind of confidence. We've got a much larger industrial economy, and we've just come off the back of a successful offensive war against Austria. It will rock the boat a little bit, but these operations are not going to require, so it'll be Operation Ajax, and I guess Operation Cleopatra. I don't think it's going to rock the boat too much, and even if another power intervenes, it's not like our entire field command is going to be tied up. It's going to really tie up probably 2 or 3 armies, maybe a third to half of our standing field command. So we'll think about what armies we're going to use for this campaign. We'll keep our armies in place for the time being in the Austrian Empire, and then we'll look to bring them back. And we'll see how long that takes, of course, as well. It might take a bit of time, but the weather's probably going to begin improving, so marching time will sort of increase, marching speed will increase. Economic administration has been set. No significant reports. We are a stone's throw now in terms of Academy of Sciences. We're not too far off now. A kind of qualitative leap in terms of resource extraction, and that is hard rock mining. We're at 98%, so probably sort of 2 weeks to a month we'll be there. And then we've got a host of kind of maritime and one army technology that we're moving towards. This is probably going to be under wraps within a couple of years, and will represent a qualitative, especially for the Navy, a big qualitative leap, and will set us on the path then to kind of modern industrial ships. As I mentioned earlier, video kind of fourth generation for the Navy is a longer term game. It requires a lot of technological, a lot of plant, a lot of infrastructure. It's not like the Army. You're not just giving guys uniforms and then getting them to kind of fire a few rounds. There's a lot that goes into this, and yeah, we're well underway. Our investments are now beginning to pay off, and we're going to start seeing some sort of practical results. Iron ships is going to be another thing as well, really. Rifle guns, and once these are complete, some of them will open up new branches. So we'll have with the army one, we'll continue artillery forces because we do lag behind. So that will go neatly into sort of steel breech loaders, which the Prussians have probably already got by 1870. Integration of marine engineers will go to radio telegraphy. That's 1890. That's some way off. Steamship of the line. There's a few options there. Then we'll see when they open up. We'll see we'll see what the priorities are and what we want to kind of invest in first. And again, everything in this game is long term. It pays off many years from now. But you have to if you don't get this stuff in early, it's only sort of in 5 or 10 years time that you start feeling the bite, start feeling the burn when you start losing hideous naval battles and realize that you're at war with a maritime power. You're completely defenseless, and just to what extent you're dependent on trade as well, even for things like state revenue. All of a sudden you've got a really large army and you don't generate enough state revenue to maintain that army, because a large amount of the state revenue comes from tax yields on things like merchant shipping and sort of tariffs and stuff like this. Why has this happened? Why has this gone down there? Let's move this up. There we go. Yeah, so a lot of the tax comes from sort of excise tax, maritime tax, stuff like that. So you get used to that. And yeah, all of a sudden you don't have a navy. You didn't invest any of that money wisely. You invested it in kind of silly things, maybe I can get maybe I can get tanks 20 years, behind schedule, which is never going to come off really. And you just miss really obvious things like in Navy. So anyway, we're going to pass turn at State Feb. Trade administration has been set. Let me double check that. Everything's pretty good there. I'm now starting to keep an eye on things like chemicals and nitrates. We've got a big stockpile of nitrates we've had dumped on the export market for years. Obviously, that it's something that's readily available because we're not really shifting very much of it. So that's good. We've got the raw materials to cushion the blow, because probably quite quickly, within the next year, we're going to start quickly outstripping what we are kind of, what we're producing. We still have so much that we can dump some chemicals. Let's quickly look. I think we're importing chemicals, and we might not be now. So we're balanced positive chemicals, but not by much, and that'll quickly change as these investments in agriculture start coming off. Interesting, no mechanical parts. What does it actually cost us? It might. See, it doesn't actually show what it costs us. So I wonder. Let's have a look at mechanical parts. See, we are running out of mechanical parts loss, but I wonder whether that's because of the initial outlay for the machines. The traction engines. National market sales 10. Craftsman production 10. So we still have enough guild-based production to cover our actual consumption. Colonial market sales 1. We've got set to maximum availability. You see, so on the surface, we've got mechanical parts shop in Salonika, one in Ankara, one in Sinop, all railroad accessed, one being constructed in Sofia. And why then are we running at a loss here? It can only be because there is an outlay. It's the only thing. It must be that there's an immediate outlay for mechanical parts. But curiously enough, no constant maintenance for mechanical parts. That's a surprise, because with mechanized mining, which I guess is probably going to be a lot of traction engines and stuff like that, and I guess small railroads and this kind of thing, and there is a constant outlay. I guess maybe because there's a lot more mechanical parts involved in mining, and maybe there's more of a durability question that they have to be replaced. Maybe with agriculture, I suppose, I don't know. A traction engine, maybe you build one and they're just basically good for a decade or something. I find that surprising. But anyway, we're going to pass turn. It's late Feb. We'll see you on the other side in early March. Okay, welcome back. It is early March, and the war is over with Austria. Again, a successful conclusion to the conflict, and the regions we secure then is, as we already knew, Fiume, West Croatia, which is good. Completely undeveloped. It's got a major road there. Its development level is quite high. We can stick a railroad in there. I think the plan for Fiume is going to be to fortify it, stick a depot in there, and make a bit of a military base also, because this is the most northerly point, I think, really, that we control. I suppose not. I suppose Moldavia, which we occupy, probably is, but it's an advantageous position. It puts us adjacent to Trieste, and is also very, very close to Vienna. So again, it's kind of if we can keep a large enough force here, we kind of keep a blade held to the throat of the Austrians. It increases our claims because it's increased the size of our territory. So we now have claims on Trieste, Laibach. Economically, these regions are a bit more interesting, a bit more dynamic, and Trieste is a place of political significance also, actually. I can see that's why they gave Fiume up, because Spalato and Cartero are places of political significance for the Austrians. As is Bucharest. Bucharest is the real prize of this war, and is the biggest prize that we've got so far, I think, through warfare. Securing this territory as a legitimate part of the Ottoman Empire it's wonderful stuff. Loyalty in these regions is going to begin very, very low, and we have very limited means to increase loyalty, being that we are the Ottoman Empire, but we already have 3 cereal farms. These are very basic. They don't have railroad access, but they already increase our production of cereals significantly. We have an old school style kind of coal extraction site there, again with railroads and upgrades, plus we have room for a further site, plus we've got Drobeta, which we're going to be securing. We're going to maintain a military occupation of Romania for the foreseeable future, really, because our kind of it gradually increases by 5 points per turn, I think, our war score. we need to get 100 or above really for them to consider ceding territory. So yeah, we'll sort of sit tight and we'll secure Drabeta, and I think probably long term also Moldavia. Moldavia is not a resource-rich region, but it is a place of sort of strategic significance, and it is a former territory of the Ottoman Empire as well. So there's an area that before 77, before the transition to sort of isolationism, we'll look to secure that. Between now, early March and the summer, we're going to focus strategic redeployments on preparing for Operation Ajax and Cleopatra. So we're going to get an army command by rail down to Salonika, get that deployed in Thessaly or Larissa, and yeah, it's going to just really sit tight, build up its organisation, make sure it's got enough of a supply train. The operation's going to be pretty limited scope in terms of what we're used to. We've got relatively little intelligence on the Greek forces, but they look very modest indeed, as you might imagine. Greece is a minor power, and Egypt's probably going to be a bit more lively, but we're going to take... what we're going to do is, we've got a core of Croatian volunteers which is being constructed. Like the uniforms, these Croatians have uniforms, they're original Austrian uniforms. They're not dissimilar to our uniforms, actually. I quite like that about Austrian army uniforms. They tended to sort of, geographically reflect. They had the pandurs and this sort of thing, and they tended to have quite sort of Southern Slavic and Ottoman, influenced by the Ottomans quite a lot, their styles. But anyway, this Croatian corps, once it's complete, we're going to redeploy that as a screening force. We'll give it a 2-star general in Salum. We'll probably have to land in Benghazi, move it to Salum, and that's just going to function as a screening force, although it will be intended to press into Gazala, ultimately. We might also release a brigade, probably this mixed brigade, or in fact it's an infantry brigade. Maybe we'll get a cavalry brigade for operations in the interior, Siva, this sort of thing, Kotara. And we're also going to strategically begin redeploying a force to Jerusalem. I'm thinking it's early March. We should have that done, I think, by June or July. It might be a late summer campaign, but we're going to declare war simultaneously against Egypt and Greece, with a view of securing territory. Attica, in the case of Greece, Gazala and Suez, in the case of Egypt. In the 1880 campaign, you can actually see the Suez Canal. Maybe the means don't exist for you to visibly see it, but the Suez Canal is now open. You can see ships passing through. I'd be interested to know whether we get any kind of benefits from that. I don't think the Suez Canal is like a sound where we get any kind of, it's sort of built by foreign engineering companies, I guess. So it's sort of, I'm not sure how much of a real benefit we get, but securing the land around Suez might afford us some strategic benefits long term. But in any case, Suez, on its own terms, that's a really cool uniform. I've got to see that. Sorry, I'm like a 4-year-old. That's, very nice. 1850 to 1870. Egyptian militia. They have the kind of black jackets of the Ottoman Marines with the kind of white fez. Very cool. Anyway, Suez is worth holding on its own terms. Really, it's a large enough sort of city. In terms of its cotton, as you might expect in Egypt, at the moment, cotton, there's such an availability of cotton and war on the global market, which is strange because during this period, you get the impression from the American Civil War, the burning of cotton bales and this kind of thing, you get the impression that there was more of a shortage of it. I don't know, but there's been no impetus in the Ottoman Empire to develop what we have formidable access to grazing areas where we get access to wool. And cotton and wool, it may be because the two commodities are kind of fused as one, really. Why is it I can never see the thing that I'm looking for? Sugar, that's opium. Cotton and wool are basically kind of one and the same thing. I guess it's an agricultural raw material. Perhaps for that reason, there's such an abundance of it. I mean, northern France, surprisingly... Oh, actually, we're the second biggest... We're not the second biggest exporter. This is interesting. This is the second biggest availability. The fact that we're not exporting any at all is interesting. It's northern France, Chesapeake. People are much more likely to import cotton. A lot of that might come from technologies. Things like certain kinds of financial instruments will give us more of a lead. So if there's a great availability of something, powers are much more likely to import from places like France or the USA, even if there's less availability. Even if they're dumping less on the global market, it means that we're going to have to try and tailor always, which we have done, our exports to things where there's a shortage of. So things like tobacco. I say it's a shortage of, there's a greater demand than there is a supply, which drives its value up. It means that even though they're less likely to buy from us than they are, for example, Chesapeake, because there's a greater demand than there is availability. It's kind of, tough luck. You'll have to buy it from us, sort of thing. I think beyond that, the Western powers, the Northern European and the Western powers like the United States, they're going to have this kind of advantage. Their financial instrumentation and stuff like that probably makes them a more appealing place to import from if it came to a choice between the two. So, and we're probably quite far behind. We are tailoring our kind of state investments into particular areas that provide us. We can't invest in everything in the last analysis, and I would rather the Ottoman Empire had a more modern and industrial sort of fleet, which other nations are going to be starting to have now, than having, like a big big domestic sort of, or rather big exports of cotton and wool. I think that's a secondary issue. We have got a really healthy export economy. I mean, Christ, this last fortnight, exports 1,200 liquidity generated on exports, 1,100 on domestic market sales, only 52 imports. It's just sensational. I mean, that's probably going to flatline a little bit now. It's going to plateau a bit because the war's over, so we don't have access to some of the commodities we were getting in the Austrian Empire. The domestic sales from the Austrian Empire are now gone. That's going to go back into the Austrian market, I suppose. So it is what it is. That said, the hope is it stays above 1,000 now. If it stays above 1,000, that is a real sign of kind of of growth in terms of a domestic market. So we'll probably leave this video here. I don't think there's anything else to really cover. The war's over. It's going to be a case of bringing our forces back, continuing the process of upgrading our agricultural enterprises. The focus is going to be, before anything else, tobacco. So I'm going to really comb through all of our sites that we're growing tobacco and increase our tobacco plantations. That's going to be the first thing. After that, I might look at things like fruits and wines, partly because we only really just have enough to meet domestic demand. There's a little bit of give there in terms of the domestic market, so we probably would shift more of wine and fruit in the domestic market if we increased. So we would see quicker benefits. Probably of all of these things, cereals is going to be the last thing. Cereals. At cereals now we're currently stockpiling. We can't shift cereals at the moment, so there is just. We won't be the only power in 1870 that will perhaps suddenly begin to have access to this kind of technology where we can upgrade our agricultural enterprises. So we are probably at the point now where cereals, we're never going to see famine again in the Ottoman Empire because we're that much industrialized. We will look to do it, however. Interestingly, the cereals farm that we upgraded, we upgraded the cereals farm. It's here. Slightly less capital, but again, it's cotton and chemicals. Cotton, coal and chemicals, beg your pardon. But for the most part, it's about a doubling of production with the introduction of machines, which creates an operational cost for coal and I guess chemicals. Maybe some of the chemicals are for the machines, but maybe also for fertilizers, I don't know. But nevertheless, all agricultural sites would now require a constant flow of chemicals. And we didn't really foresee this. We were looking at chemicals as something that we could export anyway. So we've already begun to massively ramp up chemicals production, and there's greater availability than there is demand, so we wouldn't necessarily export much, but there is going to be ramped up demand for chemicals on the domestic market. That's it. Next video will begin in the summer. There's a good chance that the next video will begin the beginning of our twin operations against Greece and Egypt, so I might sort of time it for that. Really could be July or August time, and yeah, we'll begin our next offensive war. This is a little bit risky, but I'm thinking it's a new decade. Let's begin it assertively, because what we gain now, there's a chance that what we gain now we're going to have to live with for 30 years. It's a long time. I will look at whether or not I can figure out how the Ottomans can maybe get one diplomat every couple of years, maybe every 5 years. So it kind of keeps us in the game. It allows us to reverse certain things if the game forces on us. Keep in mind that may not happen. There was no Austrian-Prussian war in 1866, which is interesting. That might be because we were at war with Austria at the time and probably occupied Vienna. There was no Mexican Civil War, from what I can remember. I think the Mexican Civil War was the late 1860s, because it was kind of during the time, it was the end of the American Civil War, and Europeans thought, oh, this is a chance that we can make a move kind of thing, and then the US recovered, and all of it, they supported the Mexican government, and that turned the tables a little bit. That didn't really come to pass, and that would have been a scripted kind of historical event. Now, the American Civil War lingered. It went on longer than expected. If we look at loyalty in the South, it's Americans now, not Dixie. I think it used to have a split between American and Dixie. I'm not sure, but it lingered along. I mean, the weird thing is the Confederacy did very, very poorly, but they managed to hold, I think, to New Orleans, or they held into one of the southern cities for like 2 or 3 years. It was a prolonged kind of siege, and it ended up going into 66, 67. Not sure if that's why the Mexican event didn't trigger, I don't know. So there are some historical events that haven't really happened. Opium Wars. I'm not great with Chinese history, so I have to check when the Opium Wars were. I suspect that Britain conducted an invasion in the 1860s. I might be wrong, or the 1850s, which I don't think has come to pass. I'll have to double check that, the Opium Wars. It may be that the first Opium War was before this time, 1840s. The second one might be, I don't know, later or something. But I get the impression that some historical events haven't fired. So the 77 War with Russia may not fire. I sort of hope it doesn't. And if it doesn't, we'll keep some diplomats saved anyway. So once we get to 75, we'll stockpile some diplomats. Hopefully we won't lose them. They won't be zeroed out by the succession of Abdul Hamid. And that would give us a little inventory of diplomats that we can use in emergencies, sort of thing. You know, so we might be in a position to reverse some of the effect of the 77 War, if that comes to pass. I'm dwelling on it a little bit well before time, but it is something that's worth considering in advance. But anyway, it's early March. Next video will be July, August time. Thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.